Hi, this is Inclusive Faith, a 5-part series from First Methodist Church, Dallas, about homosexuality in the Bible. In the first episode, we talked about the Bible in general. In the second episode, we talked about sex in the Bible, so if you missed those, be sure to check them out. Today, we're talking about Old Testament Bible passages about homosexuality. There are two right at the beginning that people have used, the straights have used to say mean things about the gays. And both of them there are two different creation stories, one creation story in Genesis 1 and one creation story in Genesis 2 that go in different orders. And somehow we managed to use both of them to be mean to queer inclusion. So, Elizabeth, start us off with, you want to start with Genesis 1 and how that's been used as a clobber passage?
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. It's a very good place to start.
Unfortunately. Yeah. We managed to get one chapter into the Bible before we said mean things about queer people.
Before we started figuring out ways we could use it to do harm. Yeah.
We're
quick on the uptake there. So this is Genesis 1. And Genesis 1, if you maybe remember, or if you don't remember.
I remember.
It essentially starts with this really beautiful invitation to consider creation and how God began creating. And it kind of breaks things up into multiple days. On the first day, God does, creates the heaven and the earth. And the second day, God creates day and night. The third day, like yada, 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 plants and animals and sea and dry land and all sorts of things. And then it says on the sixth day that God created humankind in God's image. Mm-hmm. But here's where it gets dicey. Male and female, it says, God created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it." Mm-hmm. So kind of at the end of this beautiful creation, account of creation, you get to God creating humanity, humankind, male and female, and the first directive that God gives is to be fruitful and multiply. So this is hopefully, obviously, why it has been used to harm queer folks, because it emphasizes this notion that God created male and female, so this duality of genders. And it immediately goes to the reason that God created them. Their first directive as humanity living on earth is to procreate and to be fruitful and multiply, which is what that means. So the shame with that is that it really does take this powerful story of creation, which in some ways might lead to equality between the genders. Yeah,
because God created male and female at the same time.
The same time, exactly. In the image of God. Both of them in the image of God.
And that it was very good.
It was very good. That's what God says at the end. It was very good.
Imago Dei.
Mm-hmm. And it's taken this beautiful moment, and it's, again, used to destroy and to harm, because the emphasis then is, well, it's only two genders and you must procreate. Well, even that reading, though, negates the reality of that creation story, because throughout that creation story, every day we're told that there's this duality of creation: the earth, the dry land, and the oceans. God created the day and the night. God created the heavens and the earth, right? Kind of these everything is kind of separated into this dualistic view of creation.
And all is good.
And all is good. But when we look around, we see that it's not just night and day. There is dawn, and there is dusk, and there's twilight. There is every sort of color of sky and shade of night possible. And there isn't just earth, dry land and sea. There's marsh and rivers and lakes and swamps. And there's all sorts of ways that we see transition and fluctuation between these two seemingly opposing bits of creation. So to argue, so really you could argue then that in the same way that we have day and night and everything in between, okay, well, we have male and female and everything in between. Yeah. And it's not about a duality, it's more about a spectrum.
Yeah.
And so that's how I think we can read that story. We don't have to read it just with dualistic thinking. And also, and I love this about the whole be fruitful and multiply part of this scripture as well. I actually want to quote an amazing scholar, a theologian, whose name is Amy Jill Levine. And she says, first, this text is an endorsement of procreation, but it's not a limitation of the sexual act. So while that is the command, like, okay, you should procreate, it doesn't negate having sex for other reasons. Second, this reading fails to allow sexual relationships between couples who are incapable of reproducing, which is then a denial of the goodness of creation. And this commandment ultimately was completed in Genesis 11, when humanity, following the fall of the Tower of Babel, fills the earth. Scripture tells us that humanity does at some point fill the earth, and actually causes a lot of problems. And so the idea that we must today still take this command in this one moment and apply it the same way to our life, and the only way to view sex then, it should be between a male and a female, these two dualistic genders, and it must lead to procreation because we're supposed to be fruitful and multiply. I mean, first of all, it doesn't limit sex to only that. And also, hey, we've already done it, y'all. And check. We're done.
There are other ways to be fruitful besides multiplying.
Absolutely.
Right? Like there's roles for everyone in society besides...
Flourishing. You can flourish without multiplying.
Yeah.
Yes.
By being who God created us to be.
Yeah.
Okay, so then we move on to the second creation story in Genesis 2, and it has a different order of events. So I like to say anyone who insists that the Bible is literally true hasn't read the first two chapters, because they cannot both be true. They happen in a different order. And somehow we managed to also use the second version to clobber gay people. So what went wrong there?
Well, this is when, before God creates any other living things on the earth, God creates this human. Mm-hmm. And the Hebrew word there is Adam. The way that we have often translated this into English is by giving the human the name Adam. Mm-hmm. But the Hebrew word is Adam. And Adam is actually not a gendered word. It's just human. And it's actually connected to this root word for dust or earth. Mm-hmm. So in some ways, what the story is reminding us is that God created this earthling, this thing from the earth. Mm-hmm. And it has no gender whatsoever in this part of the story. But then it says that God looked at the human, and it was not good for the human to be alone. So then you have this whole process, this whole creative story, where God then creates all these other animals in order to see if one of them would be a good, the word is helper, translated in English as helper, for the human, right? So God forms all these animals. None of them are the right fit. And so finally, thank God, we don't need to go through how we figured out if they were the right fit or not. I'm just going to leave that there. But they weren't the right fit. So the human falls asleep. God then takes from the rib. We don't know what this translation actually is, so we are guessing that is the word rib. Takes the rib from the human, and from the rib creates this other human to be the helper.
So in the text, you have the dust being that's created, which is not necessarily gendered, and then the helper is made from the rib, maybe not the rib, and neither of those are gendered. Where does it become gendered?
Well, it becomes gendered then when it talks about from man, woman was created. And all of a sudden then the word changes, and instead of Adam, it's Ish and Isha. And so that's when we have the first unveiling of gender.
Yeah, and I would say the gender that's created there is to just create difference, right?
Right.
So it's really just claiming another identity, but helper isn't subordinate. and the relationship is one of mutuality. It is not one of being subservient. And I think that it's really important to recognize that even though there are separate genders at that point, it is out of the importance of creating like separate identities from one another instead of like carbon copies.
Yeah. So it was to distinguish these two beings more than it was to create any sort of power dynamic between them, one being lesser or greater than the other. And I think to your point about the word helper, we talk about that word in English as helper, but the Hebrew word is ezer, E-Z-E-R.
Where we get Eve from eventually. No. Where does Eve come from?
No. Eve comes, Eve means life.
Oh,
and so
I
that
like
comes, later and is just like the name she's given. And then Adam.
So it's like dust and life are Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
It's almost like the Bible is beautiful and poetic when you really get into it.
It's so lovely. I do love it. But ezer is, and this is what I think is so important. You're right. It doesn't connote subservience. In fact, it's used 17 other times in the Old Testament, the word ezer, as helper. And it always refers to God. Every other time it's used in Scripture, in the Psalms, in the prophets, it's used to talk about God. So ezer is not a subordinate. The notion of helper is not this like, oh, I'll just follow wherever you go and like assist you and like all your important work. It's like, no, I'm here like alongside you. Partner, connector. And I also love this notion of being created from the side, as not from the head or the foot, but it's like we stand side by side and we're different, but of the same essence. And we are the ultimate then supports and helpers and partners to one another.
And just because men and women stand side by side and creating God's world doesn't mean that has to be what sex is about.
Right.
Like it's not necessarily limited. I think it's a more beautiful vision to see it more expansively than just like, I mean, how obsessed with sex do you have to be to read the story and be like, there's the God created from the dust, and then there's this divine helper that comes in, and they can only have sex with each other, men and women. Sorry, like it's a real like.
And again, it's only about procreation.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, and I think this is also a story that tells us about the world that we see. So it tells us, why are there men and why do they have like a slightly different body than women? And yet they seem so similar in some ways and so different in others. Well, this kind of explains it because they're similar enough to where they match and they're good partners, but they're different. But that doesn't necessarily encompass what we do about it. We put that meaning onto this text.
Correct. Yeah.
We decide then
definitely.
how we weigh the value of the two genders. And that has been the issue, from the beginning.
So then the next time that people talk about homosexuality in the Bible, claim that the Bible's talking about homosexuality is in Genesis 19, which is where we get Sodom and Gomorrah from. And just give us like a short rundown of what happens in that story, because I know there's a lot going on.
There's a lot
I
going on.
didn't even mean the pun.
There's a lot going on, yes. Because it is a story about Abraham's nephew, Lot. Yeah, I mean, this is a big one. This is a big one. This is the root of a lot of Christian exclusion and meanness and hate towards queer people. I mean, I would say this story in particular.
We name laws after it.
They have laws after it,
Yeah.
because of this. But it's the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it has to do with Abraham's nephew, Lot. So Abraham and Lot had this like big community, and then it was too big for the land. And so Lot left, and he took his herds and his cattle, and he went and he settled in the city called Sodom. And he had been there for about 20 years. He'd been there for 20 years, okay? Not really a visitor anymore, a resident of Sodom. And the Lord sends 2 angels to the city. And what happens is Lot sees them. He's out at the gate. He's kind of part of the daily life of running a city because he's sitting at the gate and being kind of the watchman. And so he rises to meet them. He bows down, recognizes them as visitors and therefore worthy of hospitality and care. And he invites them in to his home. And they at first demur and they say, no, we'll sleep in the square. And he's like, no, you don't want to do that. Please come to my town. To my home.
Yeah.
So the men come inside, but before night falls, the men of the city, it says, the men of Sodom, both young and old, and all the people, this is in the Bible, all the people to the last man, surround Lot's house, and they demand that Lot release the men who had come to him, right, these visitors, bring them out, and it says, so that we may know them. Mm-hmm. Now, that is euphemistic in Scripture, in the Old Testament, for sexual relations. So Lot says, please do not do this. Do not take these men. In fact, instead of these two men, I have two daughters that are virgins. How about if I send them out to you and you know them instead of these two men? For these two men are my guests, essentially. So the people respond. The men respond. All the men, remember, young and old, all the men respond. And they say, nope, Lot, you don't even know what you're talking about. You're not even one of us. You came here like from outside. You don't get to judge what we do. And in fact, we're going to deal with you now worse than we deal with them. And then they kind of attack. And then Lot's like dragged back inside by the angels and the door shut and everybody kind of is safe for the night. And then that's when God decides to rain hellfire and brimstone down upon Sodom and Gomorrah.
Because all these men wanted mutually respectful relations.
Yes, because they wanted to express care and concern and love for each other. And that's why, that was the issue here. All the men, young and old, every man in the whole city.
So why do we feel like this story isn't about homosexuality?
Because it's about hospitality.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds like not a big deal because we don't actually think of hospitality as a big deal. But it was a huge deal at this time. How you treated the stranger among you was enormously important for the very reason that we see in this story. Because you might be entertaining angels. Mm-hmm. That's what people believed. That God, and in other cultures, gods showed up often in disguise. Mm-hmm. And so if you encountered someone or someone came to your home or your city and you didn't know who they were, they very well could be divine. So the goal was always to be hospitable to the stranger. And that was such an important core value of that faith identity and people, cultural identity, that any kind of threat to that was really destructive. Mm-hmm. So because they were afraid.
Yes, it was that fear of attack, fear of the potential for spies, fear of scouts coming in, that the idea, right, was that if the men of the city would humiliate anyone coming in, that would prevent outside armies from thinking that this was a pushover city, right? And so
it's about power.
It was about power and fear. And so how can we humiliate these guests out of our fear of who else might come?
Right. So hospitality was elevated, and the motivation for being unhospitable was that fear and that desire to kind of show a front.
It's also weird to me reading the text that people insist that it's about homosexuality when it could just as easily be about like gang rape. Like that's what they're trying to do.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so why aren't you like standing on, the corner with the megaphone being like, let's not rape each other? Because that's like more true to the essence of the story.
It is. It is more true. And what's even wilder about the story being misinterpreted around to be about homosexuality is that in the gospel Ezekiel, in the prophet Ezekiel, it's good news, which is what gospel means. But no, in the prophet Ezekiel, it actually references this very passage, Ezekiel 16, and it says, this was the guilt of Sodom. Ready? This is what Ezekiel says. She and her daughters had pride excess of food and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore, I removed them when I saw it. So what did they do? They had pride, excess of food and ease, and they did not share it. They were not hospitable. They did not care for those who didn't have anything else.
Yeah.
So to strangers coming into their city with nothing else, with nothing with them, instead of sharing what they had, they tried to attack them and be a bigger threat to them to prevent any so-called external threats to their community. But in doing so, yeah, that was why they received the punishment that they did.
And then one of the next stories in the book of Genesis is now Lot and his daughters have run off away from Sodom because it was destroyed, and they're hiding out, and they're afraid there's no one left on earth. So Lot's daughters get him drunk so that they can have sex with him, so that they will have kids, so that they can continue to populate the earth. And the Bible's like, doesn't say anything about that being a bad thing.
Right.
So the fact that people will read this Genesis story about Lot and Sodom and be like, well, let's take moral lessons about who should have sex with whom from this, and not from the story like right down the road in the passage, it's very hypocritical, which is not surprising, but it is upsetting.
Yeah, it is upsetting. It is upsetting.
Which is the consequence of kind of pick and choosing what we would want to read or what we want to find important.
Yeah.
Okay, so quickly now we have two passages in Leviticus. One, Leviticus 18:22. So Leviticus is just, they've gotten to the point where it's like, well, let's just say all the rules that we're supposed to follow. So we have Leviticus 18:22, which says, you shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It is an abomination. And then we have Leviticus 20:13. If a man lies with a male as with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall be put to death. Their blood guilt is upon them. So Anthony, can you give us more context around those two passages?
Yes, and so as you said, Leviticus is coming to the place where they're trying to really formalize and establish the building of society and culture, establishing all these rules, many rules, and we find these two. And so on one sense, we can think, in what ways is Leviticus trying to continue to keep clean from unclean and holy from unholy? And, I think we can understand this in a sense that if women are, we're beginning to see those power dynamics playing out more and solidifying, and if women are lower, then we should not be treating men like a lower status. So that dynamic...
The ultimate insult.
Yes.
You throw like a girl.
Yes, this is the biblical sexual version of you throw like a girl.
Yep.
Yes. And, so does it say these? It does. It does say them. But also, when we take it into context, what's happening all around here is this continued idea of how do we keep safe? How do we keep clean? And, along with these are all the food prohibitions of what is safe to eat, what is not safe to eat. And there we get no pork, no shrimp, no lobster, no crab, the variety of those. But also we get, Leviticus 19, we can find restrictions on how we may or may not cut our hair, restrictions against tattoos. Leviticus 19 is also where we find that we are to treat all foreigners, all aliens, all outsiders, as if they are citizens. And Leviticus 20, where we can find that we should put to death anyone who dares curse their mother or father. So we have this strong prohibition against males lying with males and this death penalty connected to it. But frankly, they were pretty loose with the death penalty in Leviticus.
You get the death penalty and you get the death penalty.
So how do we take this? I think that this is one of those places where we have to look at these laws in the context of what early society was trying to do to create some sense of strict order where they just, I'm assuming, right, that in those beginning pangs of the development of society, that keeping things simple and black and white and how do we keep things orderly to keep people safe, can we understand it in that context, recognizing that there are many more shades of gray than could really have been taken on at that period? And are we going to pick and choose what we think's important? And if so, then we're rejecting the 99% of what Leviticus is saying by picking and choosing scriptures that we're going to use to clobber people over the head with, when recognizing that, taken into a bigger context, we can have grace for them in that early society as they were doing the best they could to keep things together, and recognizing we can learn from them and learn from what happened through that time period, but not have to live by the same structures as they did 5,000 years ago.
I think I totally agree with you, Anthony. I think one of the fascinating things is as they are trying to birth this new identity and culture, they become more polarized or black and white in their thinking, which is actually the opposite of how the creation story begins. If we work off of the, I think, beautiful example of creation being not two polar opposites, but a spectrum, we treat spectrums, folks who fall on a spectrum outside of the polar identity, very poorly. There could be good reason for it early in the creation, maybe. But today we have adopted, I think still, we understand, gray and transition and space in between as something to fear. And I think we see this with how our country has dealt with interracial marriage. I think we see this with folks who aren't citizens of our country, that we just don't do a good job with ambiguity or ambiguity as we see it, right? And so Leviticus is a perfect example of a group of folks doing the best they can that is not how we organize our life today. And that is one of the most frustrating things about Leviticus being a clobber passage is it's just so absurd to me that we would focus in on the homosexuality piece, but also then create permission to do everything else, right? That essentially Leviticus is warning against. And it goes to show that there's an incongruency in how we approach scripture as it relates to queer folks and sexuality.
So those are the 5 passages in the Old Testament that pretend to talk about, or that people claim to talk about, homosexuality. The Old Testament is like thousands of pages, and these are the only 5 times it comes up. Leviticus is the 3rd book, and there's no real mentions after that. So it's obviously not a point of emphasis, but hopefully we're able to clear some things up and provide some clarity on why we interpret the passages a little differently than people might have heard. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the passages in the New Testament, so stick around for that.